Welcome, everybody. My name is Jessica Weiss, and on behalf of the Council on East Asian Studies, the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, welcome to our discussion of China and the American election. We are on the cusp of Election Day, and in a campaign season where China has figured perhaps more prominently than ever before. We're here today to discuss what has been said, what was correct, and what this might mean for U.S.-China relations. I'm joined today by three distinguished guests who've traveled from various distances to be with us here today. First, Erica Fowler. She's a professor at Wesleyan University up the road and director of the Wesleyan Media Project. Stephen Roach, here locally, a senior fellow at the Jackson Institute and senior lecturer at the School of Management. And Jeremy Wu, who's a member of the Committee of 100 and a former senior advisor to the U.S. Census Bureau and one of the architects of the report. If you didn't pick up, you might want to get one on your way out, looking at perceptions of Chinese and of Americans. Unfortunately, due to Hurricane Sandy, rescheduling this meant that Jim Fallows was unable to join us, so apologies. But we're really happy to be able to, through thick and thin, have pulled this off anyway. Before we begin, I'd like to show a couple of clips, first from the presidential debate, and then a couple of congressional ads that have been aired on China.
China has been a currency manipulator for years and years and years. And the president has a regular opportunity to label them as a currency manipulator, but refuses to do so.
When he talks about getting tough on China, keep in mind that Governor Romney invested in companies that were pioneers of outsourcing to China.
Traditionally, Betty Sutton, if there was a tax and spend Hall of Fame, she'd be in it. Obama would give her induction speech, and Pelosi would tell her what to do. Just like Pelosi, Sutton voted for the stimulus that spent hundreds of billions and created jobs in China. Cap and trade, one of the biggest taxes in American history. And the bailout that spent billions on companies that sent jobs overseas. Hall of Fame tax and spender Betty Sutton. On November 6th, retire Sutton. Congressional Leadership Fund is responsible for the content of this advertising.
The trade deficit with China has cost the United States almost 3 million jobs.
Senator Sherrod Brown is calling for action against cheating China.
They don't play fair, and we've got to fight back. Senator Brown says his bill would force trade and import laws which will pass the Senate.
It creates and protects jobs by cracking down on Chinese currency manipulation.
I brought Democrats and Republicans together to pass tariffs on China. Now we can level the playing field for American workers. I'm Sherrod Brown. That's why I approve this message.
So as you see, this is not just a matter of presidential rhetoric, but rhetoric by congressional candidates on both sides of the aisle. If the panelists would join me up here, I would like to get the discussion started. So watching these ads, Erica, can you give us some context for what we're seeing? You know, how important are these in the context of the larger campaign advertising that we've seen this season? And are we seeing a difference from previous elections?
Well, definitely. I think so. Just in terms of context, the 2010 was really the first time that we saw China arise as a theme in ads, period. I mean, we have data tracking back to 2000. And China really barely made a blip on the radar prior to 2010. And in 2010, you saw both parties coming up with mentions of China. And that's continued in the presidential race this year. We are over 1 million ads aired in the presidential cycle to date. That's through October 29th, so we're well over that by now. And about 9% of all of those to date have mentioned China, which is truly, I think, an astonishing number.
What was the number?
Almost 9%. Wow. Almost 9%. And both parties are using this in the spots, as you saw in the clips there. We have a code in our coding sheet for the American flag, and I kind of wish that we'd had one for the Chinese, because it is very, very common. You saw it in one of the clips there. There were in 2010, one of my favorite ads that I used to display was the Chinese flag came down at the very end of the clip and said, maybe this, I can't remember who it was for, somewhere in Pennsylvania, I think, and it was like, maybe so-and-so should run for representative in China, and the Chinese flag comes down. So it's definitely a theme, it's a prominent theme on both sides of the aisle. Both candidates are focusing heavily on it. I think to date, it's about China's been, Mitt Romney ads have been slightly more likely to mention China than Obama ads, but nearly all of the outside interest group airings on the Republican side, which is about half of all of Mitt Romney's ads, have mentioned China. So that just sort of gives you the extent to which it's being used and used heavily. The most common way in which you see China appearing tends to be in ads that reference jobs. And so it's clearly a theme that is continuing along the lines of outsourcing to China, like you heard in the clips before. That's the most prominent. Not all of them are attack ads, but a great majority of them are. And I think perhaps the most interesting thing, and this happened in 2010 too, is that you don't just hear references of China in, say, the Rust Belt states, right? That might be sort of an expectation of where you might hear that most commonly, but it's definitely not the case that they appear only there. There have been mentions of China in 88 markets this cycle in the presidential race, and not just the Rust Belt. So Albuquerque, Boston, Denver, Las Vegas, all of those markets have seen references to China. So again, it is a real change from prior cycles.
Well, speaking of Romney's tough rhetoric on China, Steve, I want to ask you, what would happen if on day one Romney labeled China a currency manipulator? And do you think he would do so? Are we betting on him bluffing?
Well, I think that's a fair point, and actually I was thinking about the fact that most of these campaigns were used to having politicians say one thing, and then they get elected, and they, especially on China, they move to the center. And personally, I think that is reckless and irresponsible, and I really believe that politicians need to be held accountable for the statements they make in the campaign and the promises they make. And you just heard the clip from one of the debates, and Romney says it every day on the campaign trail. And, January 20th, when he's elected, and big if, but he'll take the oath of office at 12 noon. He'll go to the parade for a few hours, and then he'll go into the Oval Office, and the very first thing he'll do is sign this executive order. So I said, okay, let's just fast forward and give him credit for winning and signing the order. And then I wrote an op-ed piece in the FT that said, what happens next? And what happens next, it's anybody's guess, but it's quite conceivable that in a tough labor market, and Erica mentioned the fact that China appears so much in the context of discussions over jobs. The China card is played because it's the only way that politicians can respond to jobs in a way that deflects attention away from their own inability to understand the jobs problem in America. It's much easier to blame others than to take a look in the mirror. So my best guess is that while the simple declaration of currency manipulation in and of itself just means intensified negotiation between the Chinese and their American counterparts on the various economic teams, that there will be a groundswell of support in the new Congress to push through one of these currency bills that has been battered around for the last 7 years, started in 2005, where there would be trade sanctions placed on China to compensate for the degree of currency manipulation. And the Congress has come up with a number, 27.5% is a number, no matter, and I can tell you where the number came up. It's a total joke. I was present at the creation of this number. And wherever the Chinese currency is relative to the dollar, even though it's risen 30% over the last 7 years, it's always 27.5% undervalued. So the sanctions would be under this legislation that could be imposed would be tariffs on all Chinese exports in the United States set at a level of 27.5%, which would be devastating, of course, for China and for American consumers who buy things at places like Walmart, the largest retailer in the country and the world. And, you know, I'm going on too long, but what then happens is, of course, the Chinese retaliate. What is never said in these various debates is the other side of the trade equation is that China is our third largest export market and by far our most rapidly growing. So China puts trade sanctions of a comparable degree on our third largest and most rapidly growing export market. We're having a few growth problems in America right now, I think, and this would be a fairly serious consequential problem. And you could take this sort of tit for tat further. There could be further escalation by an angry U.S. Congress, and China's got the ultimate trump card here. They simply stop buying treasuries with dire consequences for financial markets. And you know, it's not a stretch to take January 20th, 2013 under the what I think is unlikely presumption that Romney wins and turn it into something that is a really dark tale.
Jeremy, as you know, China is in the midst of a political transition of its own. As China looks here at the United States, how do you think China is sort of expecting things to fall out? And is there a sense in which, if the presidential election does end up favoring Romney and he does label China a currency manipulator, how would the Chinese react, and what might some of their concerns be?
Well, a couple points there. First of all, to follow up on Steve's point about job creation, I guess when you look at these bashing ads, it does create some jobs. I think they're called fact checkers. And I've never seen so many fact checkers after every ads, but outside of that, it's really very limited in that sense. And if you look back at the U.S.-China relationship, it has been exactly 40 years, and we've gone through 8 presidents. And if you look back, every year there seems to be some bashing going on, from Ronald Reagan all the way to the latest Barack Obama against George W. Bush. So in many ways it has become sort of a political tradition in an election cycle. But I must note that in this cycle it has become very harsh, and it's beginning to raise eyebrows and doubts in many ways. And when you cry wolf so many times, at some point somebody believes it. And at that point, when the whether it's the public or the elites, the leaders thinking, when it hardens, I think it's very difficult to move beyond that turning point. So it's a speculation in terms of how China would react, but you can play some what-if games. And what if the new president comes in and say on day one, declare China to be a currency manipulator? Personally, I think that's limiting the United States to a very narrow corner that has no option. And if that happens, I think it's probably going to take months and years to untangle that. And I think it's likely that any trade war or retaliation, tit for tat, would certainly happen. I don't think China would sit down and say, okay, we are manipulators, and follow up with that. So I think we need to consider the negatives, and these are the realistic negatives that could happen. And I think every administration, after all the rhetorics, they modify their positions and it becomes more realistic. Unfortunately, this cycle, I'm not sure that it has that flexibility. It's painting, we're painting ourselves into a corner in some ways. When there are no options, we may regret what we said, and then it would take a long time to untangle something that has taken 40 years to build up.
Yeah, just one follow-up point. I mean, rightly or wrongly, I mean, Romney has this great reputation as a flip-flopper. So let's just assume that he gets elected. Is the first thing he does after the parade, does he do a flip-flop? I mean, and he just says, well, now that I'm in the Oval Office, it just sort of feels different. I mean, he's going to have to, he says this every day. He can't back down. He's in a corner. So he's going to do it under the assumption that he's elected. And, I think your question is right. We need to explore the consequences. And, I laid out some, horrible sequence of events, and I hope that, it's just a bad dream and it doesn't happen, but you never know.
Can we talk a little bit more about what it would look like if China retaliated? Most of this rhetoric seems to be, predicated on the assumption that China trade simply hurts American workers and businesses. Can we talk about who in the United States benefits from, relations with China, and why aren't we hearing more about them?
Look, I mean, this whole issue is really, I think, a most unfortunate fabrication, to be blunt. Last year, we ran trade deficits in the United States with 98 countries, 98. So take China out, by higher math, that leaves 97. So we have a multilateral trade deficit. And how do you fix, and China's the biggest piece, and we can get into the hows and whys of that, how do you fix a multilateral trade deficit with putting pressure on a bilateral currency? It's mathematically impossible. It's like, say I'm holding a big water balloon, and I put pressure on one end, the Chinese piece, and the water just goes somewhere else. And the somewhere else will be, a combination of higher cost producers that will still make things that Americans need to buy, but at a higher price. Price of your goods that you buy at Walmart will go up. And the real question, Jessica, is why do we run a multilateral trade deficit? What is it about our country that forces us to run deficits with 98 different countries? And the economic answer is that we don't save as a nation. And when you don't save and you want to grow, you import surplus savings from abroad, you run massive balance of payments deficits with the world, and behind a balance of payments deficit is a multilateral trade imbalance. So if you want to get rid of a deficit with any country, you really need to put it in the context of the broad constellation of all the deficits we run and address the savings problem. And there's no politician who has the guts to go to the American people and tell them to start saving again. Not one.
Speaking of savings and investment, there have been a number of controversies over Chinese investment into the United States. Jeremy, based on the Committee of 100 survey and your broader expertise, how does the broader American public feel about China, including Chinese investments, which are growing here in the United States?
It's a really interesting finding. This is a survey that was conducted in the spring of this year. And one of the specific areas that were asked would be about the Chinese investment in the U.S. And among the public and the business elites, as well as the opinion elites, I think an overwhelming majority, we're talking about over 80% of the business group and the opinion group, support increased U.S. investment in China, in the United States. And the public is well over 70% also. So in that regard, I think it's well received in terms of the concept. But I think at the same time there were some concerns about losing control of the economy. And I think that also is reflected in some of the current government policies. there were some attempts of Chinese investments, whether it's in terms of wind farms in Oregon or other investments in the U.S. I think outside of the purchase of the AMC, the movie chain, there have been a few others, but not massive scale. I think it's still growing. There's still some interest, but I think domestically, I think the survey also finds some concerns in terms of security, in terms of losing control. So it's sort of a dichotomy of, yes, we welcome investments, but at the same time, how do we maintain control?
So we'd like to think that this sort of China bashing has sort of, passed already. But unfortunately, just this week, Romney aired a new ad in Ohio talking about Jeep and closing down and moving to China. Well, Obama has countered, saying, no, your facts aren't quite right. So, Erica, was this a blunder on Romney's part? Even the, Chrysler's CEO has weighed in, saying, no, in fact, Jeep is unambiguously not moving production to China. Or does the truth not really matter in these negative ads?
It's a really good question, and I think certainly we're actually working on a piece right now about, speaking of the fact checkers, the academic evidence about fact checking is actually quite dismal from a public opinions perspective, because the public tends to remember the ad message more than they remember the reporter correction of it. What we're interested in is the flip side. To what extent does fact checking influence campaign behavior? And I haven't looked specifically at China, of course, but and we've only looked so far at 2008, but we're replicating it again in 2012, is that the ads that are shown to be false are actually more likely to stay on the air than the ones that aren't. So I'm not sure what that says about the Chinese ads. But I do think, this has been a prominent theme all along. It has dropped off a little bit. So if you compare our sort of top issues in the presidential campaign in September, pro-Romney ads, of course this includes the outside interest groups, China was mentioned in almost 32% of all those airings in September. Whereas if you look at October, it's down to 6.6% of airings. So the new China, I don't know specifically for that new China ad how often it's run, but you've seen it come up on the Democratic side. Sort of in the same time period. So you had very heavy Republican focus and then sort of the pro-Obama ads coming back in response. So I do think it's still, and to play back to the reason why it's being used, I do it's an easy scapegoat for both parties because it is something that you can reference without any backlash among the public per se, because you're not targeting anyone here per se. Obviously there are implications abroad, but in terms of the American public as a target, that is an easy reference that doesn't cost you very much.
That actually
in
leads
public opinion.
So it leads right into sort of a question I have, which are speaking of domestic consequences, Jeremy, can you say a little bit about what sort of China bashing might look like for the Asian Americans living here in the United States? And are there any sort of historical precedents for this kind of anti-Chinese sentiment and such?
Jessica, I think only 30 years ago there was another Asian country that was on the rise. And Japan was becoming the next biggest economy of the world. And the American public, some, not all, went to the streets and bashed American cars because there was the fear that Japan was going to take over the United States. And then there were media reports about Japan buying Pebble Beach and half of New York. And some may not remember what happened, but exactly 30 years ago, there was a young Chinese American by the name of Vincent Chin in Detroit. And he was in a bar. It was about a week before his marriage. And he was bashed to death by a baseball bat by a father and a son because he was mistaken to be a Japanese. And there was so much hate that Japanese were going to take over the United States that the case lasted a while and it caused a lot of emotions. And at one point, the father and son were released, and it was one of those Rosa Parks case in Chinese American and Asian American history. If you go back further, you have the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. It was not friendly to Chinese, and it was the only legislation in the United States that is explicitly against a race of people. And then less than 20 years ago, there was accusation about nuclear secrets being lost to China and caused big, I guess, controversies in the national laboratories. And there was the accusation.
There was a World War II internment
of 120,000 Japanese Americans. So we may not realize these 30-second, 1-minute bashing ads, but they built little by little to the American psyche, and at some point, that's what I call a point of no return, that something happens, and then we have to look at ourselves into the mirror and say, boy, what happened? And yet historical facts after historical facts, that nobody really likes to be called cheaters. Nobody really wants to be called liars, and you can be called once, you can be called twice, but at some point, it's not going to hurt just the Chinese in mainland China, but it also hurts Chinese Americans in the United States. And there are some lessons to be learned, and hopefully history will not repeat itself in many ways. And I do get concerned when I see some of these bashing that I'm not sure that there are many in, and I'm not picking Iowa or any state, but they may not tell the difference between a Japanese American or a Chinese American, and at some point that hate builds up. That there is a point of no return.
Well, and just to reinforce that point a little more even is that, you know, I think the short-term consequences to any particular politician are so small that the references are very easy. But in the same vein, we also know that as elites tend to lead public opinion, when you have so much rhetoric that's focused on China, to like how soon is it before you have public opinion that is starting to change, and then what kind of influence does that have then on the politician's behavior? So I think that is the longer term concern is a big one.
Yeah, and I also wanted to ask you to follow up on Steve's comment that, you know, Romney's basically become known as a flip-flopper. You know, do politicians really feel that they are accountable to the things that they say on the campaign trail, not just on China, but more generally?
I mean, I think they do. I think one of the biggest concerns is being painted as a flip-flopper. Romney's, I mean, handled it perhaps as well as he could this cycle, but certainly it's not an attractive adjective for any politician. And so, to the extent that they can avoid going on the record and then coming back, they'll always try to do it. Now on an issue that's, you know, this big, who knows? But I mean, I think what they say does matter, but certainly the sort of connection between what they say and what they actually do is an imperfect one.
Mm-hmm. Can we just bore in on one aspect of this, this pejorative term, manipulation of a currency, and the point that Jeremy made that then that gets taken into the realm of being labeled a cheater. And I really agree. I think you really stated your points very eloquently. That the risk is when you listen to I find Erica's stats on the frequency of the focus on China on both sides of the campaign, you know, fascinating but very alarming. But this point of no return, because you're building a powerful impression, and the impression doesn't vanish. The impression will endure in the psyche of the American people, and we can see where that impression has taken us to some pretty dark places, as you just recited. So, manipulation. The Chinese currency was pegged, in other words, fixed to the U.S. dollar through July of 2005. And it's not uncommon for a developing economy to anchor its currency to the world's reserve currency as they're grappling with development of their financial system and their economy. there was pressure from China's trading partners, the United States, Europe, but also other Asians, to relax the peg. And given the trade surplus that was building up in China, there was a general realization that the currency was too low and it needed to rise. And so the Chinese embarked on what was then called, and it has since been called, a managed float. They would guide the currency upward, which is the right direction. No one knows what the exact equilibrium level is. And the currency has risen since July of 2005, 30% against the dollar. Actually 32% against the dollar if you check it as of a couple of days ago, and about 30% against a broad basket of all the currencies that China trades with. Now, if China just let it go, it would have gone up higher. So the difference between where the market wanted to take it and where it went is called manipulation. And I think, again, that sends a horrible message, because it imputes the motives of a cheater that is directed at victimizing other people for the action. Jeremy also raised, the issue of Japan in the late 1980s. Not only did we bash Japan, but we put Japan through the same exact drill that we're putting China through now in the currency. And in September of 1985, the then G5, the group of the most powerful industrial countries in the world, got Japan in the corner in the Plaza Hotel in New York, and got Japan to agree to the so-called Plaza Accord, which forced an instant, high, rapid appreciation of the yen. And the Japanese did it, and that set in motion a series of horrific policy blunders that many have argued, including myself, have now put Japan mired in 2 lost decades and counting. So the Chinese have studied the lessons of Japan very carefully, and they have agreed to revalue their currency, but not all at once, but gradually. And some might call that prudence. Or you could even go further and call it wisdom, because you've learned from the mistakes of others, and yet, we call it manipulation. The currency has gone up plenty. China's balance of payments surplus with the world has shrunk dramatically. And there was a peak of like 10% of GDP. It's down to 2.25% right now. Its trade balance has shrunk dramatically. The currency will continue to rise, and to continue to pound the table with these sort of almost Byzantine perceptions of the menace of Red China behind it is I think it's politically expedient, but for the eloquent points that you just made, it's very disturbing insofar as what it says about the character of our nation, and that really troubles me.
We've talked a lot about this political rhetoric and the shoe banging, and I wanted to ask one more question, Jeremy, of you before I open it up to the audience for open questions, which is, aside from all this political grandstanding, there's a steady, set of negotiations that go on behind, closed doors and sort of the normal course of diplomacy. And when you were at the Department of Agriculture, I noticed that you helped negotiate the end of a Chinese ban on U.S. wheat exports. So I want to ask you, what is it like to negotiate with the Chinese, and is this a more appropriate manner in which we should settle our trade disputes? And at what point does the U.S. government decide that private channels are no longer sufficient, we need to go to the WTO and file this publicly?
That's an excellent question. I guess the word that brings to my mind would be patience. And what Jessica referred to was at one time the U.S. and China had a wheat dispute, and China buys wheat from the U.S., and yet there was an embargo against the Pacific Northwest wheat, claiming that there is a certain fungus that would wipe out wheat production in China entirely. And so it was one of the typical trade issues back in the 90s. And so between the two countries, a more scientific approach was used. And guess what? It took 10 years. And from the beginning of identifying the spores of something called smut fungus, all the way to how the tiny microscopic spores can get on tons of wheat that can go to China and be detected so that it will not grow in China that would wipe out the wheat production. And at least that's the rhetoric between the two countries at that point. And I think deep down between the two sides, they knew that it was rhetoric. And so both sides were serious. And I got a call on New Year's Eve, 1990. And basically, the Agriculture Department had conducted a joint study with the Chinese scientists and trying to decide on the microscopic spores. And they collected a lot of data, and on New Year's Eve, they said, now what do we do with the data? And that started a 10-year project for me. And ultimately, it was through negotiations, and it was difficult. One side was saying it has health impact and production impact. The other side say basically is manipulation and trying to lower price of wheat. But eventually, the premier of China came in 1999 and signed an agreement. So patience and science and knowledge can help to resolve differences. And there was no World Trade Organization at that point. So the two countries were willing to sit down and look at the problems and avoid the Cold War rhetorics and basically trying to address the issues. And 10 years later, there was a solution. And I wonder, with the World Trade Organization now, and there will be issues, and no doubt there will continue to be trade issues, but I think they all can be resolved. And given the last 40 years of development between the two countries, I think it has become pretty apparent that the two sides really want to grow the relationship, and therefore better communications and collaboration can help to resolve some of the issues.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you all for your attention. I would like to now open the floor to any questions you want to ask. If you'll please raise your hand, one of our helpers will pass the mic. Here in front.
It's been stated by the U.S. that it's moving its center of gravity.
Can we identify?
I'm Gus Wanis, Economics Department. The U.S. is shifting its strategy from Europe to Asia, and it's made certain moves, Australia and so on. Now, my question is, the U.S. has a treaty with Japan. It doesn't have a treaty with China. And there are these disputes going on with the little islands that Japan and China are arguing about. And there's some argument that Chinese have made that seems to me the U.S. is supporting Japan. How serious is this in the Chinese eye in terms of relations?
I think it's very serious myself. And to look at the gravity of the matter, you really have to look at the history of China for the last 200 years. And during the last 200 years, territories was a big dispute, and the China and Japan fought several wars. And they were about militarism in many ways, territorial rights in many ways, and the Second World War was a very bitter battle between China and Japan. And I think some have described these Diaoyu or the Senkaku Islands to be several rocks in the middle of the ocean, but I think it's taken very seriously by the people, in both the peoples of Japan and China in that regard. And I do think that at this point, a small trigger can, in fact, cause conflicts. And in many ways, it seems like the Joint Defense Treaty with Japan is something that may willingly or unwillingly draw the U.S. into the conflict. And I do wonder myself personally that a treaty that was established in 1960 during the peak of the Cold War, when China was, quote, on the other side, is it still applicable 50 years later in a repivoting situation that the U.S. is taking, whether the partnership or the alliance should also be recalibrated? That's a personal view. But it seems like if the current course is not managed well, from my perspective, I think it can be very serious and can lead to, in fact, a military conflict.
Between U.S.
or
Japan?
Definitely between Japan and China, and the U.S. may be unwillingly drawn into it because of the Joint Defense Treaty.
Mm-hmm.
Thor.
Is this on? Okay. My name's Thorsten Fries. I'm an East Asian Studies student. My question is that given the recent blocking of Chinese investment in windmills and the, I think, congressional investigation into whether the Huawei communication company is capable of covert spy operations against the U.S. Public, to what extent, given this environment, to what extent does it really matter who the president is? Because, I mean, we have these issues of animosity already taking place.
That's a fair point. Both the president and Governor Romney are, again, Eric, I gave you the numbers. They're both focused on sort of a China-bashing strategy as part of their political efforts, especially in these final weeks and days of the campaign. And I think that unless there's a dramatic change in the domestic environment in the United States, that post-election will continue to have a lot of focus on China as the lightning rod, the cause, the easy to sell and market source of the problem that's bearing down on the economy. And this is not, I don't want to whitewash China. There's a lot of issues in China, and some of the cyber terrorism that originates in China. I mean, those are major issues that need to be addressed, and whether that it's correct to single out Huawei or ZTE, which is another company that gets mentioned there as the source of this. It's fine to investigate that, and the American public has a right to know and understand and to take actions if, in fact, there are legitimate violations that have occurred. But I think we've got to be really careful post-election that we don't give a much broader footprint to the political sentiment that has really been allowed, I think, to get out of hand. One of the guys I come across, and he's been invited to Yale conferences that I have participated in, and I recently, I agreed to do a debate. I have no idea why I did this, but Huffington Post now has a video forum where they have debates on various topical issues. So they had a debate on U.S.-China, and they invited me and a couple of other people, and then they invited this fearmonger by the name of Peter Navarro, who's a professor at the University of California, San Diego.
No, can't be. Really?
Yeah, check him out. I mean,
it's my alma mater, so I'm a little concerned here.
Right, then you definitely got to check him out. Anyway, he's written a book and has produced a movie called Death by China. And it is really just filled with, it's got flags and babies dying and just all sorts of things that play to the emotions of anybody. And it's a pure charade. There's not one shred of truth to it. And so and they had the audacity during this so-called debate to actually play the trailer to the movie. And so I'm sitting there, in my office, a few blocks away on Skype, and I'm making, hand gestures. And after the trailer, I said, look, I'm going to disconnect from this debate because I never agreed to participate under the grounds that this was going to be a promotion to, a film that spews forth, this fear-mongering, vindictive diatribe against another nation. And I again, go back to Jeremy's point. The point of no return is something we need to look at. We need to look inside of ourselves and see if this is what we want to stand for as a nation. So your point on does it matter? I think it ultimately does matter, because the next president, whether it's the incumbent or the challenger, in early January of next year, there's going to be a test of his character. Can he pull back the rhetoric that and they've both done it. They've done it differently, but they're both using China as a lightning rod to play on the insecurities and the understandable pain and hardship of American workers and their families. But do they have the strength within them to really pull back? And I don't know. I honestly don't know. I hope they do. Hope one, but I don't know.
My name is Victoria Bueller. I'm a senior in Yale College. And it seems clear that the U.S. should not label China as a currency manipulator, both because of the immediate threat of retaliatory sanctions, but then this larger danger that China might play the trump card. However, if the U.S. doesn't engage with China over the currency issue now, it's clear that as China's power grows, there will be areas in which the U.S. does need to engage with China, and not sound like I'm interested in manipulation, but areas in which the U.S. needs to extract concessions from China. So given this, are there any sort of hidden leverage points the U.S. can draw on to increase its bargaining power, as opposed, like in opposition to China? And if we don't currently have a trump card, should we be thinking about developing one?
I'll take a first stab at this. I think part of the issues that has developed is really trade between the two countries. And both import and export have grown over the years, except that our export has not caught up with our import. So if we become more savvy, I think if we can reduce the barriers, I'm pretty confident and I'm pretty optimistic that the U.S. can improve its performance on exports and narrow the trade deficit. But at this point, you do have to wonder, is the government helping in terms of the American companies selling to China? The Committee of 100 survey seemed to indicate that the public seemed to point at U.S. policies as a barrier to that, with about 70% of the respondents indicating that the U.S. Policy may be creating some of those barriers through policies or bureaucracy. So it seems to me that in one area that can help to relieve some tension is our export to keep up with the imports. At least that's one area that I can think of.
But look, it's a great question. It really is, and you know, it's a two-way story. I mean, you know, we push hard on China for a variety of different motives, some of which are fair and some of which are really wide of the mark, and China pushes back on us, reflecting their own constellation of motives. We need China. We need China to you know, buy our debt because we don't save. We need China as an offshore production platform to enable American consumers to stretch stagnant wages over a larger market basket. But China needs us. You know, China needs us for the fuel of what is still an export-led economy, and they need us for their transition. I mean, Victoria's in my class, so she knows I talk a lot about the transition of China to a different type of an economy, consumer-led, as opposed to an export and investment-led economy. And China doesn't really have a clue as to what a consumer-led culture is all about, and you know, unfortunately, that's something we know a lot about. We've taken the model to excess, but there's a lot that is not programmed in the DNA of the Chinese producer model that bears on what they need to know and build in terms of creating a consumer culture. And you know, there's a lot that they can rely on us and that we can offer them in return that is mutually advantageous. You know, the two countries are, from an economic point of view, very dependent on one another, to the point where you could even argue that they've gotten into this rather delicate zone of codependence, which is, if there are any psychologists in the room, you can speak more eloquently than I can on this, but that's not a very healthy and stable relationship if you don't require both participants in a codependent relationship to engage in a deep psychological therapy.
Some have called it mutually assured financial destruction. That's what's over our heads, but it also makes it perhaps difficult for China to use this so-called trump card, which actually makes me a little bit less pessimistic about this rhetoric on economic issues getting too far out of hand. I'm much more pessimistic or concerned about some of the territorial disputes in the region and the prospect of a military conflict in which the U.S. might be drawn.
There's one point about the intellectual property rights that I don't think we have touched upon, but I think that's an area that both countries can also work on, and I think China has been accused, and I think rightly so, about the need to respect the intellectual property rights. And I do believe that I think I visited China for the first time about 30 years ago. Compared to today, there has been tremendous progress made in that area, but I think it still needs a lot more to work on. And I think China is facing its own problem now in the court system when it deals with IPRs, the intellectual rights, property rights cases now. More than half of them are internal Chinese issues rather than dealing with the foreign countries at this time. So it's a matter of growth into that area, and I think overall IPR is a hot topic. And I think it can also produce a lot of progress if the two countries collaborate on it.
The gentleman in the back has been waiting patiently.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Dr. Jason Liu. I'm the current executive board member of the National Organization for Chinese American. We have a headquarters in Washington, D.C. Myself has actually pretty involved with this China-U.S. things. I was the first one to make the West-East breakthrough to establish Shanghai Bell Telephone Manufacturing. Looking the progress made, but my concern is really this, because this is a really a very high impact, high stake game, geopolitical and trade and financial issue. Unfortunately, the current superb American democratic process have the requirement to get a vote. How do you get vote? You have to emotionalize the debate. That's a reality. And even though I'm a Chinese American really is a very small minority here. They definitely have consequences. But my consequence is not on the individual, to the Chinese American or Asian American, but it's really to the future of America itself. How could we elevate, enlighten the American public to a higher level of sophistication, dealing with the globalization, China included? And Yale University itself has been cultivated many of the American leaders in the past. I want to, from the audience, I want to really so-called mainstream Americans, how could we, American, to maintain this democratic merit, yet to produce a system to seriously, responsibly, and prudently dealing with those many challenging issues in the future. I think the American election process itself has to be examined by the future and current and future leader. I want your comments and also the students' inputs. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe Erica, you could speak a little bit to money in politics, and this is not just specific to China, but the overall tenor and level of discourse in American politics and on television.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the first things. So, you know, I teach up at Wesleyan University, just right up the road, and I would say the same thing to students here at Yale as I say to my students at Wesleyan is, I love having you in class. You're intellectually curious, and that's one of the reasons I love having you here. But you are absolutely not the average American. And that you have to start with that assumption if you want to really understand public opinion and political behavior in American politics. Because the average American it's not so much, I mean, in the public opinion literature, there was a lot of debate over sort of the incompetence of the American public. And I think that gives the American public a little too little credit. I don't think it's that people are, say, stupid, and that is a common critique. I think people are sophisticated enough to get it, but they don't pay attention to politics. They're busy. And that's the way I describe it, is that the average American is busy. They've got their job, they've got their kids, they've got, you know, the other things that are going on in their lives, and they don't, you know, the sort of, especially the key persuadable public, which is really what we're talking about here, right? We've got 1 million ad airings in the presidential race in fewer markets than there ever have been, so it's a fewer amount of citizens are actually seeing that onslaught. And they're not intended for even the majority of the people that are in those markets, because there's nothing that Obama or Romney can say to convince the other side's partisans. So what we're really talking about is that very small segment of persuadable voters in the key battleground markets that will make a difference for the Electoral College. So it's tough. I think it's very tough. But I do think, you know, the average American also gets it, right? Even if I don't pay a lot of attention to politics, one of the reasons you see so many political ads on television is because that's one of the primary ways that the campaigns actually talk to those voters, because those voters aren't, right, listening to the news. They don't read the papers. They're not political junkies like I am, you know, and read 10 things before I've even had breakfast in the morning. And so that's the primary way that they talk to these people. But you know, citizens don't have.
Don't you get hungry?
Yes. Too much coffee, I suppose. But you know, I think too that, you know, citizens don't necessarily have to pay attention to politics to understand some things. You know, when they go to the gas pump and fill up their tank, and when they talk to their neighbor next door, and when they, you know, sit around the water cooler at work, you know, they get some cues about how the state of the economy is. And China is, I think, very far afield from what their cues are, and that is one of the reasons I think why it's being used so well. I will stop blathering on, but I mean, it's a great question, and I do, I think we all would wish that the American public was more sophisticated and paid more attention. But it's not the world we live in, unfortunately, and I think to really understand at least the political side and the political game and the reason why you're seeing what you see is you have to start with that assumption. It's not necessarily that the politicians are, the politicians do pander, but one of the reasons they do that is because of the dynamics of the public.
But what he was also asking, Erica, is if there was a strong feeling that the political system was really producing potentially damaging results, how might we change it? Mm-hmm. Is there a process by which we could actually contemplate altering the ground rules of debate, term limits, campaign finance reform? Are there a number of things that should be brought into the discussion more actively here?
One, I think, so in each one of those, and this is just, political science tends to be the hold on, calm down, it's going to be okay type of mode, is that, the problem with term limits is that you actually do want people who know what they're doing, so to speak. There's a big, learning curve.
You think these guys know what they're doing?
Well, in some cases, no. In some cases, no. But, in campaign finance, we've been trying to sort of close the loopholes in money and politics for a very long time. And every sort of at every turn you find the loopholes keep getting bigger and wider. And, the BICRA, the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, was supposed to close the soft money loophole for parties, and what we ended up was a transfer from party spending to interest group spending, and we can talk about whether or not that's a good. On the upside, the positive of all this campaign spending is that we know that citizens have more meaningful things to say about the candidates, and despite all the anger and negativity on the airwaves, those things actually, there's evidence that suggests that actually does create information seeking and people who don't necessarily pay attention. So if there's something good to be said about that, it is that the people who don't necessarily pay attention, if they're exposed to some fear through the airwaves, they actually are more likely to go out and seek additional information. Now, what they're getting in that additional information is, of course, the key question. But
this may explain why Chrysler got so many calls saying, you're moving Jeep to China, and then Chrysler came out and said, no, we're staying right here. In fact, we're increasing our operations.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Jessica, may I offer a small story here? One of my, I'm a great admirer of a great American, Norman Mineta, and some of you may have heard of him. And he was one of the 120,000 Japanese Americans who were interned during the Second World War. His family lost all the properties, and if there is one who should be really mad at this country, he should be one of them. And yet, I would like to quote him, and basically he said, America is great not because it's perfect, but because it can correct itself along the way. So he rose to be one of the mayors of San Jose, and then one of the congressmen, and eventually became the first Asian American Secretary of Commerce in both administrations, Democratic as well as a Republican administration, also in the Department of Transportation. So his story was very inspiring to me, and I have a very optimistic outlook in that regard. And I think no matter how small the percentage of Chinese Americans would be, or the Asian Americans would be, the organization of Chinese American is a great organization. It's a grassroots organization. I participate actively in it, and it plays a big role, and play a very optimistic role that we're very happy that we have a role to play, and we participate actively in the American system, be a part of the American society. And as a member of the Committee of 100, each one of us also dedicate ourselves, and that is how to further the Chinese American contribution to the American society. That's our ideal, that's our passion.
Thank you. Another question from the audience? Yes. Please go ahead. In the middle? Yeah. Yes, please.
Oh. Me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm Emily Tong. I'm an international investment banker. In the last 20 years, I basically spent a month in China and a month in the US. So I commute. And so I actually get both ends in terms of grief and in terms of joy. So what you said, I don't think that there's anything new that nobody here that I never heard before. Yes, through the conversations and your presentation, Jeremy, you did mention that we need patience, we need better communications, we need this and that. But basically, it seems like it kind of referred to somebody else. My question is, how can each one of us here in this room do something about it such that this can be changed for the better? And I'd like to hear the wisdom of all four of you.
From my perspective, I have happily retired from the federal government. But I also remain very active, both in terms of working with government employees, working with community organizations, and I'll be taking off and visiting China next week, actually. And I'm engaged in one project some of you may have heard of, and that is in the internet age, there's big data.
Yeah.
And big data is something that can help open up government, make it more transparent. And I'm hopeful that China and the US will follow through with that, and that is build these smart countries, build these smart cities. And I think the World Bank and the State Council of China had released a report earlier this year. It's China in 2030, that it would be a modern, harmonious, high-income, creative country. And it may be very idealistic, but once upon a time, an American president also said, you know what, in 10 years we're going to the moon. And we need that kind of optimism. And everyone has a role to play, and I'm very active in the Committee of 100, and we believe in three things. One is education. The education exchange between the two countries would be vitally important. I think you mentioned you spent 1 month in China and 1 month in the US. The fact is that only 1% of Chinese have visited the US, and maybe 6 or 7% of the Americans have visited China. So if everyone has a chance to do that, I think it would greatly promote the understanding of the two sides. Second area, I think, is in terms of leadership development, and the Committee of 100 has been very active in terms of grooming leaders of both sides in the United States and in China, looking for visionary, idealistic individuals of both countries that can be the future leaders, one way or another, that can see the value and promote the collaboration between the two countries. And thirdly, we're very active in public diplomacy. So between the leaders of both sides, we try to meet, visit them, and essentially build bridges. So everyone has a role to play. And it's a matter of how you view it, how you see it, and I mentioned earlier about participating in American society, and that's also an extremely valuable role If anything, in my retirement, I don't have enough time to do all the activities, but I wish I would. And then I think individually, I think everybody can make time to engage in some activities that can be rewarding and, in fact, benefit people that you may not know, but in the long run for a bigger mass of people that you didn't realize.
Like Jeremy, I'm also a big proponent of people-to-people education. When I was an undergraduate, I started an organization to bring student leaders from both sides together to become friends. But as Erica pointed out, the people who select into these programs already, we're sort of preaching to the choir. And so the real challenge is reaching people who aren't paying attention and who might sort of in a very knee-jerk fashion react badly to something they don't know very much about. I mean, I'm very encouraged by the fact that more and more students across the country are learning Chinese at a very, very early age. It's hard to imagine them seeing China as something scary and foreign when they have the ability to read, the novels or the short stories or even the kids' books from the very beginning of their education. But how do we get there? How do we get 30 years down the road where many more Americans already read and speak Chinese, or an equivalent or even larger numbers of Chinese speak and read and contribute to American discussions? That's how do we get from here to there is, I think, the question in this interim when fear-mongering still really works. That's that transition, both in this sense, but also in the military and other sorts of aggregate power. This transition period is really what has me worried.
Yeah, I would just add one thing. It's sort of easy for us to say, well, these are politicians and they're playing election year games, and there's a whole big population of non-politicians who are really truth-seeking and are more honest with the people they come across every day. I wish that were the case with respect to China. I have, over the years, maybe over the last 10 years, I have personally testified in front of the U.S. Congress on U.S.-China trade issues or other types of China-related issues, 12, 15 times. And when you testify, you're usually on a panel, 4 or 5 people like this, and you're chosen to represent your institution, but there are other academics or business people and other so-called defense experts. They're not all non-politicians. And yet I find that more often than not, and I would say by a margin of 2 to 1, and these are leading thought leaders, heads of very well-known think tanks, academics from institutions on a level like this. They will present views that are prejudicial and biased and not accurate from my point of view. I found in my life is sort of like yours. I did 30 years of investment banking. The last 5 years, I was going back and forth between Asia and the U.S. and yet still doing some of this, participating actively in the debate in this country. And I personally got sick of having my own credibility as an expert witness drawn into question because I was a senior executive for a Wall Street bank who had a big business in China. They said, well, he's just trying to get business with the Chinese. And that was the furthest thing from the truth when I would actually honestly present my views in the United States Congress. So I welcome the opportunity to come to a place like Yale to make certain that there's a debate. I don't claim to be right, but I have a point of view, and I'm more than willing to engage others in this institution and to participate in the educational process of this great university to make sure that the students get a broad spectrum of exposure to debate on issues like this. So it's hard to say that one person can move the needle, but if we all say that, then the needle doesn't move. And if enough people get involved, I think you can make a difference.
We have time for just one more question. Here?
I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. Oh, wait, let's make it two. You keep it quickly.
So my name is Angelo from the School of Forestry and Environmental Study. We talked a lot about the bashing China mentality in the political campaign here. So I'm curious about, since China is also going through its once in a decade top leadership transition, do you guys see a possibility of a strong political discourse of bashing USA in China as sort of a reply to the bashing China in USA? Thanks.
I'll take this since I work on Chinese nationalism, although everybody else is also welcome to comment. Unfortunately, I don't think that there's any need for China to react to this latest round. The America bashing in China has a longer history and dates at least back to 1999 when the United States, in a NATO airstrike, accidentally bombed the Chinese embassy in Yugoslavia. So there were large anti-American demonstrations at the time, although when 2 years later there was a collision between a Chinese fighter jet and a US spy plane over Hainan, the demonstrations weren't allowed. So it's not that anti-Americanism or USA bashing is out of control, but the kinds of rhetoric that we're seeing here only sort of adds fuel to the fire. There's a lot of apprehension, not necessarily about the rhetoric, but simply the fact of U.S. policies in the region. And so there's sometimes I think we have a tendency, I mean, it's scary and I'm concerned that it's boxing in U.S. politicians here at home, but there are real policies underlying, regardless of who becomes president, that are of grave concern to Chinese. And so a very influential commentator and professor said that he would actually prefer a Romney presidency, not because Romney would necessarily be more friendly to China, but at least there wouldn't be this illusion that China was somehow, or that the US was somehow sympathetic to China's rise. So it's only through that lens of, there's embedded suspicion regardless, that perhaps the rhetoric then gets added on. So in the interest of time, I'll go to our last question and then please.
It is. Okay. I'm Bethany Allen. I'm a master's student in East Asian Studies. And I wanted to comment and ask a question about what Professor Fowler had brought up about education and how educational initiatives are so important. It was you who said that, wasn't it, Professor Fowler, about education?
Well, I agree with that.
We all like teachers.
Yeah. Someone brought it up, and I can't quite remember who. But I really feel strongly about that the more American students who have the opportunity to spend time in China will really help relations between the two countries. However, I feel concerned because I worked in China for a couple of years in a study abroad program, and that was through the CCCU, which is a consortium of a little over 100 small liberal arts colleges and universities. And unfortunately, the trend, and I'm not sure if that is simply these schools or if it's merely because of the economy the way it is, but a lot of these schools are pulling funding or creating a lot of barriers for their own students to participate in this particular study abroad program. And I really believe that measures such as the new 100,000 Strong initiative are really going to do a lot for this, but I really hope that not just really great universities or really very well-funded and well-known and prestigious universities like Yale and others continue to pour money into this, but that very middle-ranking schools across the country and even community colleges are able to have more study abroad funding, more study abroad programs, more Chinese language courses. And do you think that is a trend that can be a trend, or that will happen? And or is there more funding going to that, or do you know about that? Thank you.
Perhaps Stephen or Jeremy could speak to this?
I don't think I can really speak on the funding side, but I certainly echo the sentiment that you expressed.
Abby.
I don't mean to put a downer view. My name's Abby Newman. Microphone? Oh, microphone, yes. And on a downer note here, but my name is Abby Newman. I'm Executive Director of the Council on East Asian Studies, and I thank you all for coming tonight. Just from a perspective here from the Council, this actual program is supported today with funding from the U.S. Department of Education, Title VI grant that actually calls Yale and many other institutions across America a national resource center for the study of East Asian languages and cultures. The reality that we are faced with, and part of this is just, I think, financial downturn that really the global economy is suffering. That funding has been cut, and the grants that we've applied for, and the true status of what is going to happen with the U.S. Department of Education, which funds so many different opportunities for cultural exchange, the study of foreign languages, not just Chinese, but a broad spectrum that it's of great national interest that students are learning from at all ages, starting from K through 16 all the way up. The reality is that funding is cut. The U.S. government has a very important role, and I think we're at a very important crossroads on many different levels with the election of what is going to happen with those funding sources to help the smaller schools that can not only teach the languages but also have these exchanges and a variety of programs that are of national interest and of strategic interest. So we're experiencing ourselves here at Yale for federal funding and many other institutions that have had funding cuts. I don't want to end on a really downer note, but it's a reality that's going on.
And perhaps it's a call to action. So
very much a
thank
call
you
to
all
action.
for joining us here, and please join me in giving a big round of hand to our panel.